partner communities kung saan doon i-apply yung or i-implement yung agroforestry. So only then na makita natin yung difference ba na maging acceptable siya, unlike when you simply introduce tapos yung farmer na target natin hindi pala interesado. So I think yan ang simula. Siguro marami pa namang gawin, pero at least you start with the right thing ba, no? So yun lang siguro, no, in the interest of time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm just wondering, siguro mamaya-maya there will be a couple of questions na mag-a-arise para sa ating resource persons. In the meantime, tatawagin na po natin si Camila Ribeiro, all the way from Australia. And she will discuss designing smallholder-based agroforestry systems. Okay, Camila, take it away if you're ready.
Thank you, Sir Rotasio.
Thank
I'll
you.
just share my screen with you. First of all, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
My name is Camila. I am a researcher for ACIAR here in Australia, but I'm actually from Brazil. I am an agronomist, and before I joined the ACIAR project, I worked with several agroforestry projects in South America, in Brazil, in Peru, Bolivia, and also here in Australia. And so today we're gonna talk a little bit about, I wanna share with you some of my experiences with agroforestry design and specifically for smallholder farmers. Although most of my experiences are from South America, we share with the Philippines a lot of similarities, both in terms of vegetation, temperature, and soil, but also in terms of the material conditions of smallholder farmers. So I believe there are many overlaps, and many of the experiences can be quite useful for the experiences in Iloilo. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for your invitation. I'm happy to see some familiar faces, both from VSU, but also from farmers, partners from Iloilo. It's nice to see you again. Nice to be here virtually with you. Okay, so can everyone see my screen? Can everyone hear me properly?
Yes,
Everything
yes.
okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay,
Yes.
good. So we'll start. So the topic of my presentation today is designing smallholder-based agroforestry systems, but I also subnamed it. The subtitle is Agroforestry Beyond Consociations of Trees and Crops, because there is this initial idea that agroforestry is just the combination of agricultural crops and trees. But it's a lot more than that. It's also very important to think how you manage this combination of species. Otherwise, there is a very high chance that the agroforestry system may not succeed. So it's very important to think how you design, and the way you design, it's thinking about how you're gonna manage it in the future. So that's the main topic for today. So for my presentation, we're first gonna briefly look at the definitions of agroforestry systems, the types of agroforestry systems, what are the variables that comprise these different types, the difference between traditional and more complex agroforestry systems, and then we're gonna talk about design and management. So let's start by the definition. The first definitions started in the decades of the 1980s, talking about the integration of woody perennials and crops. But nowadays, in the last decade, this concept of agroforestry has been evolving And now the systems aim at not only combining different species, but also through the design and the management, enhancing the biodiversity and the productivity of these systems. As Sir Dennis spoke in his presentation, there are lots of potentials for livelihoods, but also many experiences point to the importance of these systems for farmers' food security, for income diversification, which is something that Mr. Sir Dennis also mentioned, but also for community development. Some scientific studies, some recent scientific studies point to the potential for climate change mitigation. So some of them even measure the amount of carbon. This one that I mentioned here, all the scientific publications are mentioned in brackets here. And they show that there is the potential of increasing carbon stocks, even sometimes more than secondary forests. The potential for ecosystem services, for enhancing the pest management and saving expenses with pesticides and other inputs by managing agroforestry systems properly. You can also, the farmers can also save in spending with external inputs for pest management. There's also a potential for carbon, for water savings as well. In this study here that I mentioned, they have identified 60% in water irrigation savings as compared to monocrops. And there are also many studies, recent ones, pointing to the financial viability and the labor input, meaning the return to labor. In this first study that I mentioned here, they are talking about, they are comparing cacao monocrops with cacao agroforestry, and the amount of time spent by the farmer, the return that they extract from this time spent working in the agroforestry, they earn a lot more from this hour worked in comparison to cacao monocrops. In this second example here from 2013, this study points to economic returns higher than local wages in Brazil. So the local farmers were also able to, after 3 years, earn more by working in their agroforestry systems than by their off-farm jobs. So there's a lot of potential in there. Now, the different types of agroforestry systems. We have the agro-silvicultural, which which is the most known, which combines agricultural crops and forestry. And here we see even some examples in which we have corn. So in both of these pictures on the right-hand side top and left-hand side bottom, we see corn here as a possibility of being one of the components of these agricultural systems. In this other picture here, we have an example of coffee, but this could also be replaced as cacao. Another type of agroforestry systems are the silvopastoral, and they can combine not only carabao or cow or cattle, but it can also combine smaller livestock like poultry and also goats and other forage animals. And we also have a combination of crop, forestry, and livestock. They can be either combined, integrated in the same area, or a rotation can occur as well. So these are the three basic different types. And these different types also comprise many variables. These variables are the complexity of the systems, meaning the number of species that these agroforestry systems comprise. The scale, so meaning the size, either if it's a small home garden. The labor input, so the amount of work that the farmer invests in the system can also vary a lot. And also the objective. We're gonna look at each of them quickly. So the complexity, in complexity here, as an example, we have just a mere intercrop of banana and coffee. So it's only 2 species. This is a very simple agroforestry example. Then we have other systems which are a bit more complex, like the Towngia, for example, which has also a combination of vegetables and short cycle agricrops. And we have the what we call successional agroforestry systems, or we can call it complex agroforestry systems as well. So as you can see in the picture, this example has a wide range of vegetables in the middle row, but also you have in the side rows a very varied combination of tree crops, and also these trees, they perform different functions. So we have trees that are in there for nitrogen fixing, trees for biomass production, which is very important. We're gonna talk a bit further on. And we also have trees for timber and fruits, and they're all very densely combined, and they are harvested in different times. The scale, so we have agroforest home gardens, which are usually closer to the farmer's house, and they're in a smaller size. This is the smallest unit we could think of as an agroforest. Then we have agroforest farms. And then we also hear about agroforest landscapes, which is a combination of, in the landscape is different plots where you find in some plots forestry, in some plots agriculture. But this is a bit tricky because it requires a lot of planning at a landscape scale. So what is for our project in Iloilo, the most adaptive, the most appropriate systems would be agroforest home gardens or agroforestry farms, which are around up to 2 hectares to 5 hectares. Then we have also a variation of labor input, and this is going to vary according to the crop rotation. So the amount of crops you have and the cycle, the life cycle of these crops. Another activity that requires labor is mulching. So protecting the soil is very important for agroforestry systems. Otherwise, they're not going to perform what we expect from these systems. This is a very key component, mulching and covering the soil. Also the grass management, pruning, which is also very important if you have for the tree species in the agroforest to maintain their productivity and to avoid excessive shading in other crops you have. And also you will spend labor input in harvests. So there has been, in terms of labor inputs, there has been a lot said that, agroforestries are not, they require a lot of labor input. That's not always necessarily true. And this requirement of labor input can also be an opportunity for community involvement. So you can bring, for example, in these pictures here, are examples from Brazil, in which they are bringing, school children to learn about their agroforestry system. So you can involve school children, for example, municipal schools in helping the farmers to harvest, and in return, they can learn about these systems. They learn how to appreciate nature. They learn the importance of preserving. And in the top hand side here, we have a community of, it's similar to a people's organization in which they are organizing a working bee. So they organize in every different time, every different weekend, all of them gather to help one of the members, one of their PO members. So in that way, they optimize their labor input. In a weekend, for example, they make a good progress of their agroforestry systems, and then all they help each other, and that also brings the community together. So there are opportunities of education and also community involvement in agroforestry to solve the problem with labor input. We also have, in terms of objectives, we have some agroforestries which are specifically for restoration, in which we use lots of natives, and the objectives is not necessarily for production, for high yields, but we also have agroforestry systems which are specifically to generate high yields. For example, in this picture here, you see quite a wider scale of an agroforestry farm. You see the rows here, they are planted in rows to facilitate the management, the harvesting. And these are very, this is a commercial scale agroforestry systems. So which is another real example that the agroforestry can be a commercial and a livelihood source for farmers. Now we're gonna look at simple versus enhanced agroforestry systems. There are many differences between the common agroforest and the enhanced agroforest. So for example, in the common, the simple agroforest, we're only talking about species consociation. It's only the combination of species, and then they call, this is called agroforestry. But there is no, for example, commitment to gradually reduce the use of external inputs, for example. Now, in the enhanced agroforestry systems, there is a careful planning and a careful design of what species are going to be in there. They are usually highly diverse, which is something that Sir Dennis touched on his presentation. So the more diverse these agroforestry systems are, the less risk this will offer to farmers, and a lot more biodiversity will be brought to the area as well. And the enhanced agroforestry systems, they mimic the nature's ecological processes. So we learn with nature, we see how the forest works, and we try to mimic the processes of the forest in our managed systems. We're gonna talk a little bit more about this further on. Another very important characteristic of successful and enhanced agroforestry systems is that they aim at reducing their independence from external inputs gradually. So you are building soil fertility as you are managing your agroforestry system. So you need to buy less and less fertilizers, you need to buy less and less herbicides and pesticides, and that also reduces the costs of the operations. Another important thing is to look at, when you're going to implement your agroforestry, you have to look at your area and understand whether your area is in an accumulation stage or in an abundance stage. I'll try to explain this a bit more. The accumulation stage are areas that are highly degraded. They have been vastly, say, logged, or they had a very major fire impact, or as an example in Iloilo province, where the examples I had contact because of the very intensive corn farming for many, many years in a row without letting the land fallow. These areas are highly degraded. And so when you have an area that is highly degraded, we call it in an accumulation stage. So when an area is in accumulation stage, some species are not suitable for that area. For example, cacao are not suitable for areas in accumulation stage right at the beginning. So Usually, these areas need a bit of working for the first years to build soil fertility, and then you can introduce that species. Otherwise, you may experience a very high seedling mortality. So it's very important, if you have an area in accumulation stage, it is necessary that you manage this area to build the soil fertility. And then after building the soil fertility, you can introduce some other species. So in order to build the soil fertility, we have some key species that help us with that. Some we call cover crops. So an example of cover crops would be pigeon peas. And we have also other species that produce a lot of biomass. So species that grow fast and produce a lot of biomass are great species to start this work in accumulation areas in accumulation stages. Now, if we have areas that are in abundance stage, or if we have worked accumulation areas and now they are in abundance stage, then it's a lot more easier. You have a lot more of microbial activity in the soil, and then you can add some species which are more demanding in terms of nutrients. Now we're gonna go a bit over the principles for design and management of these agroforestry systems. We're gonna talk about 6 main principles. They are high diversity, looking at the natural succession, the stratification, soil cover, plant density, concentration of biomass and energy, and selective plant removal and pruning. So let's start first by the high diversity. So systems that are in order to have high diversity in your agroforestry, you have to choose species that are going to perform different functions in the system. So some of them will have the function of biomass, and these are very important. They are essential because they will help us build the soil fertility. Then we can also have these species of economic interest, but these are usually more nutrient demanding. And we also have some species for ecosystem services. An example for species of ecosystem services would be banana, for example, which tends to accumulate a lot of water in the area. Bamboo also has a tendency to accumulate water in the area. So these are, it's a species that can also increase, can also perform the function of ecosystem services. And by having a higher diversity in of species in your agroforestry, you are making a better use of the vertical and the horizontal space of your farm. You are promoting beneficial interactions, and some studies point, and I'm citing the studies here, for better biological control of pests and diseases. So the higher the diversity of the agroforestry, the smaller is the tendency of having you know, a very big problem with pests and diseases. You also have more income diversification, as Dennis mentioned, and highest financial returns. Everything okay? Can hear me so far?
Yes, yes.
Yes?
Yes,
Continue?
yes. Okay.
Okay, let's continue. We have also higher financial returns. This study that I mentioned here from 2016 is a study where they analyze many agroforestry experiences throughout the country of Brazil. And the higher the agroforestry systems with higher diversity of species show us the highest financial returns as well. Now, another important, the second principle here is the natural succession. So that means we learn with nature in order to manage our system. So if we look at a forest, for example, A highly diverse forest does not have problems with pests and diseases in a very high scale, for example. And that's very much because it's highly diverse, so it's related to the first principle of higher diversity. And some other things that we observe when we look at a natural forest, as the picture here shows, besides the higher diversity, we see that the soil is covered with litter at all times. So that protects the soil fertility. It prevents the water from evaporating, so it keeps the water on the ground. And another thing that we observe when we look at natural forests, and we can try to mimic this into our agroforestry system, is that there are many different species, but they also have different life cycles. So sometimes one reaches 2 years old and then the other is already in the end of its cycle. And so we have the species, they vary throughout time. They have different life cycles. And in that way, they are sharing the same space. They overlap in space at some specific points. But because they die and are born in different times, they also give way to the following species to thrive. So when we look at natural, this is a image to depict a bit of the natural succession. When we look at an area that was degraded, for example, and if we leave it just for the natural succession to occur, you have very low plants in the first, say, 5 years of this succession. And then for the next 5 to the next 2 decades, you see more higher plants, and then you see it becomes more dense after around 20 years time. And then further down the road, you see some of these trees die, so they fall and they open areas of light, and then the succession restarts. So we try to mimic this in our agroforestry systems as well. So this is the stratification. So when we use the principle of stratification in our agroforestry systems, we maximize the photosynthetic efficiency. That means that our plants can be more productive, even if they are planted in higher density, because they occupy the same space just for a limited period, but then at some other times one will die and one will remain. So here is an example of a highly stratified agroforestry systems. We have the more herbaceous, the creeping species, which are mostly the agri-crops. Then we have the low stratum, which is, for example, you have yam, but you also have in the medium stratum, you have species like cacao and coffee. Then in a higher strata, you have species like Madre de Cacao, and then you have emergent ones which appear after all this succession happens. So now if I would like you to take like just only one message from my presentation, that will be what we're going to talk about right now, which is soil cover. Okay, this is something I have been only twice to the Philippines, but what I have observed in the areas I visited and the experiences is that there lacks soil cover, and this is very critical because it increases the risk of erosion. We lose soil fertility, and without soil, without a good fertile soil, we cannot have productive areas. And so because we understand that we cannot keep buying fertilizers all the time to keep our soils fertile, there are natural ways in which we can build the fertility of our soils. And that starts by covering the soil. This is very important. Here I'll show you some experiences also from Brazil. in which they find different ways to cover the soil. The first one here is by pruning some trees that, you know, have too much branches and they need some pruning. So they utilize the branches, they cut it in small logs, and they pave the soil, they pave the area with these logs. And this is an excellent alternative to keep the soil covered. You keep the water content in the soil, you help all these microorganisms in the soil to remain there and to build the fertility. And besides covering, you see you have some pineapples here, you have some camote, you have some cassava in the picture here. So in between the soil cover, this is excellent for the plants as well, because the plants like to stay in a soil that is covered, because also you protect the temperature of the soil. It doesn't become excessively hot. Okay. In the middle here, you also use, now it's a different material. This is a straw. So examples of straw could be, you could use rice straw. You could use even the corn remainings from the previous harvest of corn you used. You can use that corn to cover the soil. You can also, if you have an area with grass and you cut the area just to cut the grass, if you mow the grass, you can lie the grass in between your crop rows as well to protect the soil. In another example here, we see that they used the banana stem. So they made the harvest of the bananas, and with the stem they cut in small logs, and they pave these areas to protect the soil, prevent the soil from eroding. This is a very excellent, these are excellent options for salt technology as well. So for the areas with high slopes, in order to maintain the structure of the slopes, you can use these materials as well to prevent the erosion in salt technology. Here are a couple more examples for soil cover. In here, we see a profile diagram showing how you can make this soil cover. So it's very important to keep to be very generous when placing the soil cover in your crops. For the trees, for most of the trees, they like to have this little sloping, and this is to help accumulate water here. So that also is a protection for the young seedlings against drought. Just so this is for most of the seedlings, but for example, for citruses, they don't like accumulation of water. So it's very important that you consider which species you're working this with, but as a general rule, the soil cover is never too much. So this shows a little bit what I was trying to explain. So in the right-hand side, you see a seedling without soil cover. So you see the rain here is hitting the soil particles. They lose the soil particles, and that is the first step to erosion. You also see in this area, there's evaporation of water. So there's water being lost here. And also the sunlight heats excessively the soil. So this is a perfect combination for disaster and for seedling mortality. Now we see here soil cover, what we call mulch here. So we see the soil cover. When the rain hits, it protects the impact of the raindrops. It also helps the soil fertility. So you have microorganisms here, which are nice, in a nice environment to help build the soil fertility. And also the sunlight hits the mulch, hits the soil cover, and doesn't excessively heat the soil. So that's also an excellent protection for the seedling and also for erosion. Here we see an example here with corn, and the soil is covered here with dead material. There's also when the soil is better covered, there's less competition of roots, so you can plant more densely as well. Here you see, for example, a highly dense agroforestry in its initial stages. So you have banana here, you have corn, you have some different types of vegetables, or they are all densely planted, but they will not occupy the same space all the time, because, for example, you're gonna first harvest the vegetables, so this is gonna give more space for the corn and for the banana. Then the next ones to go will be the corn, and then the banana will have more space. And also some tree seedlings that could be here, they will also, as they grow, they will gain more space as you harvest the different species in different times. So for an example, this is a practical example that Brazilian farmers use to plant in density. This is an example for cassava. So you have the cassava cuttings here. Instead of planting the cassava cutting in a 90-degree angle, they plant in a 45-degree angle. And in that way, the roots develop here more to this side. And then they plant the seedlings on the other side. So you could be vegetable seedlings or tree seedlings planted very closely to the cassava, but the cassava is not going to disrupt these seedlings because the roots are more to this side. And after we harvest the cassava, these seedlings here will have more space to grow. And while the cassava is here, they're also giving shade and keeping moisture for these seedlings. So it's a simple but effective way to try to optimize the small resources we have without having to buy a lot of things to enhance the agroforestry. Here's another example of high density agroforestry. Again, we see the soil cover, we see a high diversity in the agroforestry lines here. Now let's go to the fifth principle: concentrate energy and generate biomass. So this all relates to the previous four principles. So effective ways when you're designing your agroforestry, there are two basic options. You can plant your agroforestry in islets, so small areas, small circles in which you plant in high density. But for economic principles, if you want to have high yields and you want a commercial objective for your agroforestry, to make it lines is an effective option. And these lines can be highly diverse, and also by being highly diverse in density, you are concentrating energy and geochemical processes there as well. I'll show you here a schematic area. When you are designing these agroforestry rows, it is very important for where you are in the Philippines to rotate, to design your agroforestry facing south, okay? And put the species that demand more sun facing south of your system, okay? Would anybody be able to tell me why is it important to face the more light demanding species south?
Any answer from the group?
No.
They perhaps are still thinking, why?
Because of the sunlight.
Yes, exactly. So you have more sunlight availability if you face in the south. So for example, if you're going to combine for the Iloilo farms, for example, that have corn, if you want to combine corn with trees, so you want to make lines of corn and then lines of trees, you have to face the corn to the south, and then the tree rows are behind, okay? Because otherwise, if you put the trees facing south, they're gonna provide too much shade for the corn, so it's not gonna be as productive. So this is very important to look at the orientation of the sun and orient your agroforestry facing south, and putting vegetables and corn to have more sunlight during the first hours of the day. Also, you see here in the design that there are some areas, this is an example of highly degraded areas with grass. So there is grass here. In these cases, you don't, in some more advanced types of agroforestry, you don't need to try to fight the grass. You don't need to try to win the grass. It's like that saying, if you can't beat your enemy, become an ally of your enemy. So instead of looking at the grass as an enemy, we can try to make it our ally. And by making the grass our ally, we can generate more biomass to the agroforestry system, and they can actually help us build soil fertility. How is that? So you see there is a wider line here of grass. So what do farmers in Brazil do? They cut this grass and they throw the grass remainings in the agroforest. They cover the agroforestry lines with this grass that they just cut. And by that, we'll be protecting the soil and will be giving nutrients and carbon to the agroforestry crops. I'll show you some other examples here. So for example, in a bit slopey agroforestry systems, you could have the line of corn here, and this line is very important that it faces south. Then it's very important to have wind breaks, okay? So not necessarily trees that are going to produce, they're not the ones performing production. The wind breaks will be protecting the other agri-crops from the maize management. This is an option for Iloilo farmers, especially for the ones that still use, you know, glyphosate or use still some inputs that they don't want it to go to the agri-crops. So instead of planting the production trees here, plant wind breaks. So this will block this, and you have to have fast growing species for wind breaks here. This will protect inputs to flow to the agri-crops, and then for your commercial interest trees are up here. Never forgetting to cover the soils in all the areas. So for the agri-crop rows, for the trees, for the maize, for all of these lines, it is very important to keep the soil covered, and you can use the grass as our ally for that. Here are some other examples of how you could organize your agroforestry. Here also a schematic of what they use in Brazil. So we use, for example, Madre de Cacao here, because it's fast growing, it's gonna help with biomass, but it's also going to protect from inputs. Here you have wide lines of grass, and this grass you periodically cut and provide as a food for your agricultural row here. So when we look at this map, for example, an example of how this would look like in the first 3 months, you have corn here with some other agricultural species, then we have grass. But with time, you see that these lines of grass becomes smaller because the trees and other species start to grow, and these lines here widen. So the same system in 3 months and the same system after 2 or 3 years, it's a lot more diverse and a lot more productive. Then the same system in 7 years. This is how we could envision. So you see there are lots of different species here. You have yam, you have cassava, you have the bananas, you have trees for timber. Okay, you can have other species here like cacao. Then another option, instead of having a line of, this is for more not too degraded areas, you can also have rows of regenerative species. Instead of having grass here, you can also have some trees that have the purpose of regeneration. So you have one line of agri-crops, one line you leave for natural vegetation, and plant some seedlings that have the purpose of regeneration. So the same thing, an example of this, looking at a profile, this is how it would look like in 2-3 years, and then in 7 to 10 years, you see the species, everything becomes a lot more abundant. That follows the natural principles of a forest, the natural principles of nature. Here is what I spoke about, cutting the grass and placing this grass here in the agricultural lines. Then we go to the last principle, which is selective plant removal and pruning. So pruning is very important for the trees that you put in your agroforestry. First, because the cuttings, whatever you prune from your trees, is going to provide biomass, and it's going to provide nutrients, return these nutrients to the soil, but also to make these trees more productive. Open sunlight also for the lower stratum. So for some species, some studies looking at the importance of pruning, it shows that in agroforestry systems that prune, they minimize the competition of trees and crops. They enhance the productivity and the profitability of trees intercropping systems, and here are several studies. When you cut 50% of the crown of Acacia manjo, for example, resulted in 4 times more sunlight compared to unpruned trees. And in the same study showing that instead of 50%, if you cut 25% of the crown of the tree, which is one-fourth, it was only 15% of sunlight, and that results in yield as well. If I'm not mistaken, this is a study talking about maize intercropped with Acacia manjo. So there are different types of pruning depending on the tree. So if the tree is for timber, you prune in a certain way. If it's a regeneration tree, another. If it's a tree, if it's a fruit tree, it's a different type of pruning. But as a general rule for all of these, it's important to eliminate sprouts. It's important to leave the leading branches. Cut, eliminate overlapping and crossing branches. So sometimes you look at the tree, there's one branch like this and one like this. So when branches are crossing like this, it's no good, it's not productive for the tree. And eliminate parallel branches as well. So if you have 2 branches that are parallel, you choose the most vigorous one and leave just one, and then your tree will be a lot more productive in that way. And remembering that there are different prunings for fruit, timber, and companion trees. The companion trees you can cut a lot more intensively, a lot more frequently, and a lot more in terms of volume as well. For timber trees, also important to cut the side branches, so you can stimulate the tree to grow in a very straight shape, and that's gonna increase the timber value. Okay, so we looked at the principles, and I'm starting to wrap up my presentation here. I just want to wrap up with key takeaway messages based on some observations that I had when I was in Iloilo, and also based on my experiences in South America and Australia with agroforestry. So what I observed is that the fruit trees, sometimes in some agroforestry systems, the fruit trees in Iloilo are adapted for abundance systems, and they are being planted in sites of accumulation stages. So it's important to generate a bit more soil fertility with the techniques we just spoke in this presentation before adding the fruit trees. There is a low diversity of the system, so sometimes, and this makes the system more vulnerable, both in ecological terms, but also in financial terms. There is lack of soil cover, and this is urgent. This is probably the first issue that has to be looked at, and it's completely solvable. It's possible to solve this issue. There's a lot of organic material around, a lot of trees that can be pruned, remains of rice and corn that can be used to cover the soil. The important is to keep the soil covered at all times. Let's not lose any more soil fertility. Let's stop erosion. There is lack of pruning, so also by pruning you could also address the problem of soil cover. And the lack of pruning is also hindering the productivity of the trees. It is necessary to train farmers and extension officers of appropriate management for soil protection and pruning. And it's necessary also to synchronize the planting schedule with the application of inputs, for example, with corn. So if in areas where farmers are producing corn but also want to introduce trees, we have to organize this schedule and plant the seedlings in times where the inputs have already been applied and are not going to be reapplied in the near future. Okay, so this is just to finish, I'm placing here some pictures of examples of corn integrated with other trees and crop species. This is just to inspire us a little bit to diversify our systems in Iloilo. It is possible. I've seen it in many other parts of the world, and I've met incredible people, excellent farmers in Iloilo, and I'm confident that we can make this work in there as well. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations for that straight Filipino. Tagalog. There will be more when you get back.
Yes, I want to learn more. I actually apologize for not presenting in Hiligaynon. I'm sorry, but I will learn more when I go again.
That will come later.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering if there are questions from our participants from San Dionisio and Sarah. May question po ba? May tanong? May concern? May idea? May clarify? If you don't mind, Camila, I tended to talk in Tagalog.
No problem. Don't worry.
You showed, this is just a clarification, picture on cassava, that instead of, that one planted 45 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering what seedlings were those that were planted near the base, near the cassava? Are these vegetables or also trees?
So they can be either vegetables or trees.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's it can be either way, and you can also some farmers use direct seeding. So they seed, so you plant the cassava and then near it you plant your vegetable seeds, for example. or you can plant the seedlings near the cassava as well. But it's important to know the location, right? So one side is you leave for the roots of the cassava to develop. So in the case here, the left-hand side is for the roots of cassava, and the right side is for your vegetable seeds or your tree seedlings.
Okay.
So you can use both.
Thank you so much. Thank you. New information for me.
Ah, that's good.
Okay. Yeah, our participants from Sara and San Dionisio, this is an opportunity for us to ask questions and be clarified, because after this, you are expected to conduct training or farmers training on agroforestry. Magtatanong nga lang ako dun sa mga taga either Sara or San Dionisio, meron kaya mga sample na agroforestry farms na makikita natin dyan? Sara or San Dionisio, meron po kayang merong agroforestry farms? O kaya kahit isa lang na agroforestry farm sa San Dionisio? Yes. San Dionisio or Sara? Meron kaya? Yeah. Siguro. Jong, meron Jong? May agroforestry farm? Choppy ka Jong, choppy. Meron.
I just can I just say one more thing, Sir Tasio? I want to put myself available for both farmers and extension officers and staff in San Dionisio and Sara. May and John, they have my contact, my email. They know how to find me. So if you have any further questions later on, or if you need any help with or questions for your designs of agroforestry, I'll be really happy to help you with that. So if you'd like to contact me later on, you can just tap into May and John with your questions, and I'll be really happy to help.
That's a great news. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think anytime today, there might be questions that will emerge. I hope you will be available, Camila.
Okay, I think I won't be available for the entire workshop, but if I'm not here, I will take your questions and I'll make sure I'll answer them later.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
you.
Let's give a round of applause for Camila.
Thank you, guys.
I hope everyone is still fine, still strong, still energetic. Do I get a guess?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yung mga taga San Dionisio, okay lang kayo dyan? Kaway-kaway nga.
Ox na ox.
Ox na ox. Yun. Mga taga Sara. Asan yung mga taga Sara natin? Sara. Medyo madilim natin yung taga Sara. Yung lighting.
Yung ilaw, sir.
Yung ilaw. Okay.
Energy conservation.
From design, medyo pupunta na tayo sa tatawid na tayo, pupunta na tayo kung anong itatanim natin. This time, we will have a professor of the Department of Horticulture dito sa VSU. And we'll talk about agricultural crops for agroforestry system.